Is the console concept as we know it about to evolve? Is streaming high-quality, low-latency gameplay over the internet now actually a viable alternative to owning a home console? Google certainly believes so, leveraging its vast data center network and its huge influence over internet infrastructure to set up Stadia, a gaming system with next-gen level processing specs, ultimately available to stream on smartphones, tablets, TVs and computers. There's the potential here to radically change the nature of the games we play and the speed with which we can access them. But fundamentally, Stadia needs to overcome profound technological challenges to replace the local experience. Now, the firm is promising a 4K HDR experience at launch, which is a pretty awe-inspiring target actually, and I was keen to check out what the end result actually is. Now, to get the mooted 4K experience, you're going to need to buy a Stadia bundle pack like the Premier Edition, priced at €130 or dollars, or 120 of our mighty UK pounds. What you get in the box is an innovative new Google-designed controller, plus a Chromecast Ultra for connecting to your TV, in combination with a 3-month subscription to Stadia Pro, opening the door to a limited selection of free games along with top-end 4K HDR streaming. So yeah, an ongoing sub for 4K in addition to buying games? I think that may well need a rethink. But still, initial setup for optimal play on a living room flat panel is just a little bit convoluted and it actually requires the use of 2 apps. First of all, Chromecast Ultra is attached to the HDMI port of your TV, then plugged into the mains. The power supply also features a LAN port, and while not essential, I do recommend using that to attach the device directly to your router. Google's Home app is used for a relatively painless setup. Then you're directed to the Stadia app for setup of the controller, principally to hook it up to your Wi-Fi network. After that, Chromecast and controller are linked, and a button combination later, you're good to go. Setup here is interesting in that Chromecast and controller are individual clients for the Stadia network and don't actually talk to each other directly. Google believes that by cutting out the middleman, you lower latency. It's an approach we'll have to test more, but initial results in latency response certainly look pretty impressive. Of course, there are alternatives to the Stadia Premier Edition configuration of Chromecast and controller. Simplest solution is to hook up a USB pad to your computer, then head over to the Stadia website, log into your Google account, and you're good to go from there. In this configuration, a range of pads are supported, including the Stadia controller itself, which has USB-C wired functionality. Another alternative is to connect a controller to a smartphone and play from there. However, in the Android ecosystem at least, only Google Pixel 3 and Pixel 3a phones are currently supported. That's not great for a launch, and you'd think that the biggest selling Android phones would have been targeted too. But for this review, I'm focusing on the big screen experience, primarily because right now at least, it is the only way to access Stadia's top-end video output. Ultra HD at 60 frames per second with HDR support. However, actually accessing this does require some serious bandwidth. On a standard UK 30 megabits per second fiber connection, it wasn't possible to get a stable experience, even though the Stadia app rated the connection as good. I personally think for decent results, you need a connection rated great or excellent instead. My experience on this connection may well be a limitation of my ISP. Now, regular viewers might be wondering why I've not looked at Microsoft's xCloud yet. And well, the Xbox tech people have uncovered some issues with my ISP, but that's fine. It's a beta after all. So I'm using a 200 megabit connection to see the results you're going to check out in this video. Anyway, once into Stadia, there's the sense that the platform isn't really complete. Integrated Google Assistant support wasn't available in the test phase before launch. The UI is very basic, and there's a strange reliance on the Stadia mobile app for basic functionality like buying games or adjusting stream quality. Other essential features like family sharing aren't active either. Google itself is pitching Stadia almost like an evolving platform, with the Premier Edition aimed at elite users looking for a great big screen experience as early as possible. But you can't avoid the sense that the current setup is far from the finished article. I mean, look at xCloud and you're effectively getting the full Xbox environment in the palm of your hand. Going back to OnLive back in the day, well, for all its faults, its front-end functionality was remarkable and very forward-looking, and crucially, complete. But in the meantime, I'd say that there's bigger fish to fry here with Stadia. We've got to check out the core viability of Google's cloud gaming system for starters. And when we looked at the system at the Google campus earlier in the year, image quality from a computer was essentially unchanged from the Project Stream beta, and while latency numbers looked good, we had no apples to apples comparison points. And as we were running the system on a Google connection, we can assume that it was exceptionally good. So the question is this: out of controlled conditions, how does Stadia fare? Latency testing first, and it's back to basic stuff here. I'm going to be pointing a high-speed camera at both controller and screen, counting the frames between button press and the resulting animation on screen. Now, do bear in mind that different motions in-game, running, jumping, shooting, whatever, can produce different levels of latency. So I'm doing the best I can here by comparing Stadia to Xbox One X using the same motions in the same areas of the same games. The idea here is that by matching the same actions from system to system, we can build up a picture of relative latency from a local experience to a cloud-delivered version. One further caveat: there can be variations in latency response between platforms running the same code, something I've noticed to be especially true of Unreal Engine games. Probably the most useful comparison then is Shadow the Tomb Raider on Stadia, which offers up a 30 FPS high resolution mode and a 60 frames per second performance alternative, and those two modes are present on both Stadia and Xbox One X. Results here indicate a delta of 50 to 56 milliseconds between the local and cloud-powered experiences. But what's really surprising here is the variance between 30 frames per second and 60 FPS modes on both systems. That's a whole lot of extra lag for halving the frame rate. Next up, Destiny 2, perfectly playable on Stadia and delivers the 60 frames per second experience that Xbox One X cannot. But even so, it still feels snappier on console, and this is borne out by the latency numbers. The best result for Stadia is a mere 44 milliseconds differential between Mortal Kombat 11 running on Xbox One X and Stadia. But yeah, as I said, Unreal Engine game latency can vary a bit between platforms, which may explain the relatively close numbers here. Ultimately, the question is how the games feel in the hand. Nothing I played could be considered in the least bit unplayable or very laggy, with the possible exception of Tomb Raider in quality mode. But I even got used to that after a while. No problems at all. More tests on more titles and more input methods may put Stadia into better focus, but 45 to 55 milliseconds of lag is perfectly acceptable for many experiences, and even a fast-paced FPS like Destiny 2 plays out fine on the pad. Obviously though, if you're gaming on a living room display via Chromecast, do make sure that game mode is enabled on your screen, and definitely ensure that you're using a LAN connection on the Chromecast there to eliminate as many potential sources of latency as you can. On to the next crucial test then, image quality. Google is selling the Stadia Premier Edition as a 4K HDR experience with its bundled Chromecast Ultra. And that is indeed the type of signal the device is outputting to my LG B6 OLED. In fact, HDR works fine on lower resolution too, and it just works out of the box when you load up a supported title. In order to show Stadia at its absolute best, we've managed to capture the Chromecast Ultra's HDMI 2.0 output, while playing on a 200 megabit internet connection, all of which is our effort to ensure maximum bandwidth and stability and the highest resolution output possible. And let's kick off by taking a look at what I believe is the most impressive port in the lineup of the games that we were given pre-launch, Shadow the Tomb Raider. Now let's talk tech specs. Stadia uses a 2.7 GHz Intel CPU. While not confirmed, we suspect 8 cores and 16 threads. Meanwhile, this works in combination with a 10.7 teraflop AMD GPU. Sounds awfully similar to RX Vega 56 with the full bandwidth HBM2 memory found in the higher-end RX Vega 64. When combined with server-level solid-state storage, we're looking at a hardware spec here that comprehensively outscores Xbox One X on all levels. Now, we're going to be carrying out more detailed Stadia analysis on key titles going forward, but Shadow the Tomb Raider is an excellent piece of work and a great place to start. Google promises us a 4K experience, and in Tomb Raider's quality mode, that's what you get, viewed through the lens of a compressed feed, of course. A performance mode is also available, which is the preferable way to play and does seem to deliver a locked 60 frames per second, based on the admittedly small sample of gameplay I've worked my way through so far. But it's not 4K, you need the quality mode for that. Okay, so this is a native 4K video, and the fact that we're getting native 4K here from Shadow confirms two things. First of all, Stadia can indeed deliver Ultra HD streaming, and secondly, well, it confirms that we're able to capture it at full fidelity. And that latter point isn't as straightforward as it might sound. Now, in terms of Tomb Raider here, the game's general darkness does help the encoder in maintaining more quality. More bits, more bandwidth can be spent on the brighter, more detailed areas, but there is still some loss of fine detail in the darkness. Generally speaking though, while some clarity is lost, the image holds up in motion. Now this is a 4K video feed from the Chromecast. The game is rendering at 4K, but there is obviously video compression in play here, and the ultra precision you typically associate from a 4K feed is lessened a touch. There are some visual changes between Xbox and Stadia versions of the game, but the only negative point I've really picked up on so far is the reduction in anisotropic filtering quality on Stadia. Curious, but there we are. Our friends at Nixxes seem to be responsible for this Stadia conversion, which is very well executed overall. And I'm looking forward to checking out the other Tomb Raider titles in the streaming lineup. However, our next port of call in the here and now, Destiny 2 from Bungie, where we see a very different strategy from the developer. As soon as you boot Destiny 2 on Stadia, you know you're in for a very different experience. For starters, the prolonged, agonizing loading times on the current gen consoles are enormously reduced, but more than that, there's a profound shift in rendering priorities too. Console Destiny 2, limited to 30 frames per second, as we know, but the Stadia version runs at 60 instead. It may not be faster than the Xbox One X version in terms of controller response, owing to the cloud-based nature of the experience, but it's certainly more pleasing to look at in motion, and the frame rate here, that 60 frames per second, does hold steady in the most intense, hardcore battle scenes I could put the game through. But there is a cost to this performance level, and it's pretty straightforward to see where the trades are based on the comparison feeds. There's a reduction in resolution compared to Xbox One X. I mean, there it is. So our time with Destiny 2 on Stadia played out on the same connection during the same session as our Shadow the Tomb Raider testing. Well, it resulted in a 1080p experience, scaled up for 4K output over the Chromecast Ultra. HDR is supported, the high frame rate is very welcome, and there's no doubt that the experience is exceptionally good fun, but it's not quite what we expected from a system with this much graphics power, especially when you consider that the PC version of Destiny 2 is one of the most well-tuned, well-executed PC ports of this generation. So yeah, the comparison feed also hints at some reductions in the game's visual features too, which we'll be looking at more closely in due course, but fundamentally the idea that Bungie chose to lock at 1080p resolution on a high-profile title like this does raise some questions when we're dealing with a 10.7 teraflop GPU. Now, it's early days for Stadia development, of course, and we've no real notion yet of the challenges facing game makers in producing games for the system. but it's not really something we expected to see from a cutting-edge hardware configuration. Our final game focus for this review is the big one, Red Dead Redemption 2. Stadia is based on a Linux OS running the Vulkan graphics API, and we know from our recent PC testing that Rockstar supports both this and DX12 with the latest iteration of the Rage engine. We also know that invoking the PC game's higher-end features comes at a cost, so the developer's choices here in how to use Stadia's power should be intriguing. Again, the obvious takeaway from Stadia is that despite a 4K output from Chromecast Ultra, the game itself is rendering at a lower resolution. It took a bit of effort to figure out what's going on here, but the evidence points to Red Dead 2 operating with an internal pixel count of 1440p, compared to Xbox One X at full fat 4K, 2160p. Again, we'll be looking at the specific visual feature set of the Stadia port in a video coming up very soon, but first impressions suggest a good level of similarity in terms of specific settings with the Xbox One X version. Meanwhile, the Stadia port of RDR2 also seems to be running at the same 30 frames per second as well when viewed via Chromecast, and that's kind of weird because if you play via the web or on phone, which limits the stream to 1080p, well, then we're given a 60 frames per second performance target. So, after a bit more digging, the answer lies in the Stadia app's data and performance menu. The best visual quality setting gives native 1440p rendering at 30 frames per second, while balanced, the standard for web and phone play, runs at a more unstable 1080p 60. Okay, so here's the thing, locking specific resolution and performance modes to output resolution didn't work very well for PlayStation 4 Pro. The bottom line is that users need to have an easily identifiable choice here from within the game, just as you have that choice in Shadow the Tomb Raider. So what have we learned by looking at those three ports then? Well, I'd say that there are two key takeaways. First of all, at the highest streaming quality level, image quality from the encoder is pretty impressive. Stadia's compressed stream seems to add some blur, and that blur can be compounded by temporal anti-aliasing and resolution upscaling. But bearing in mind how tricky streaming games is, the quality level achieved here is very impressive. What Stadia delivers is also a significant improvement over what I saw previously from Google streaming technology during the Assassin's Creed demo period. Now, how this level of image quality holds up in more bandwidth-constrained situations is a test for another time. But the question is really whether marketing Stadia as a top-end 4K gaming system for big screen play is the best way forward when the absolute clarity you associate with Ultra HD isn't on par with established experiences, and when you're actually charging a price premium for that UHD video signal. However, what's more concerning is that for a system designed to take on the next generation of consoles from Sony and Microsoft, the three key ports we tested don't tally with the kind of increase to performance we would hope for from Project Scala or PlayStation 5. A more powerful CPU in Stadia delivers the 60 frames per second Destiny experience we've always wanted from the consoles, but Xbox One X's native 4K picture is still a class apart in visual terms. Stadia's 10.7 teraflop GPU is much more powerful and more modern than Xbox One X's core technology, so we would hope to see an improved experience on the Google system, whether it's in pixel count, visual features, or both of them. Strangely, the jury is still out on this so far, when the leap in tech should have delivered at least parity with the X and, well, possibly further refinement. Obviously, it's early days for Stadia and there's a lot the system gets right. The controller is excellent and innovative in the way it directly connects to the cloud as a separate client. While image quality can't really hope to equal the local experience on a living room display, it's still delivering results that I'd consider quite impressive. And while never pristine as such in the way a local output is, Stadia does look good, especially on smaller screens. Yes, there is perceptible lag, but remember that the vast majority of players out there are gaming on flat panels with game mode disabled. Lag is a thing that many gamers just accept, and game mode off, well, it's kind of ballpark similar to the kind of lag we're seeing with Stadia here. Now, latency is important for sure, but across my years of cloud testing, I consider a consistent response to be more important. But yeah, it is a streaming system, and what you lose in precision, detail and latency, you gain in convenience, big time. Load up Red Dead Redemption 2 or Destiny 2 in parallel with their console counterparts, and the huge reduction in loading times alone is tremendous. Meanwhile, just to get the comparisons in place for this article, I've had to leave my Xbox One X downloading overnight a couple of times to access games that can have storage footprints in excess of 100 gigabytes. Put simply, instant access to anything and everything in your game library has enormous value. As a technological statement then, Stadia impresses with the best image quality and latency I've seen from a games-based streaming platform. But there's definitely scope for improvement from a stability perspective, and I'm not sure the question of what happens when someone taps into your bandwidth has been adequately resolved. Audio stutter and wobbly resolution were common on my fiber connection, and even a 200 megabits per second hookup had very occasional slowdown when somebody else on the line started a big download. Games can't buffer video to iron out these issues in the way that streaming systems like Netflix can. And while there's the sense that many of the challenges in streaming games have been addressed significantly since the dark days of OnLive, bandwidth is still very much a precious commodity for most users, and Stadia, at its best, highest image quality, requires 20 gigabytes per second of the stuff for an hour of play. And to maintain that kind of load, it really helps not to have somebody else in the house downloading or streaming Netflix or whatever. So in that sense, Stadia exists, it's launched, it's out there, despite the fundamental realities of how an internet connection is used in the home, how it's shared, how it's used. This is a system that pretty much demands exclusive access to your internet bandwidth. Perhaps more pressing though is the value proposition. Netflix works because the subscription model is easy to understand. You pay extra for more screens and for UHD, but that's it. Stadia is the same in terms of demanding a premium for UHD, even if key titles don't actually seem to be rendering at 4K, except that you're still paying top-end prices for your games on top of that subscription, combined with the feeling that the platform and the ecosystem is still way off completion, and I do feel that it's perhaps too early for Stadia to be rolling out as a full service, especially when games are limited and the all-important platform exclusives are very thin on the ground. So I've noticed that Stadia is getting a really hard time in the press, and this kind of highlights the struggles that streaming platforms are going to have while bandwidth is still such a precious commodity. But I'm still intrigued by the platform itself, the specification of its servers and the performance that those servers can deliver. And there's a ton of really interesting games in that 22 title launch lineup. Yes, they are pretty much all ports in a world where a new platform really needs exclusives. You get one with Stadia, Guilt, an intriguing Unreal Engine 4 game, and it's certainly visually arresting, though hardly on par with a AAA first-party exclusive. But yeah, beyond that it's ports. Ports that are likely to be more expensive than they are on other platforms. But still, for the technologist in me, I'm really interested in checking them out. So there we are, Stadia, my review. Still lots more to test, and I'm looking forward to doing just that. But in the meantime, please do like and subscribe to support our work. And yes, you know where I'm going next. There's a bell there. You can click it in order to get instant notifications whenever we post new content here on Digital Foundry. Obviously, I am urging you to ring that bell. And if you love what we do, if you appreciate the attention to detail, well, consider the DF Patreon for supporting the team more directly in our endeavours. And yes, you'll get pristine quality video downloads into the bargain. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for making it all the way to the end, if indeed you did. And of course, just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.